She just wanted her grandmother to hear again. But what the technician saw inside the old device changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The house stood at the edge of a forgotten neighborhood in East Atlanta, where the sidewalks cracked under creeping roots and the air often smelled faintly of dust and jasmine. The porch sagged slightly under its own weight, as if it, too, had long since given up the idea of holding itself proudly. Behind the crooked screen door, in a home choked with silence and clock ticks, lived Jonathan Bale. He rose every morning at precisely 6:40, not because there was reason to, but because his body no longer allowed for sleep past dawn. He brewed black coffee with stale grounds and sat at the kitchen table in his frayed robe, staring at nothing in particular. Some days he picked up a newspaper from the porch. Other days he didn't bother. The headlines were all the same to him. Noise, too much of it. What little contact he had with the outside world came through envelopes, utility bills, Veterans Association pamphlets, the occasional charity flyer addressed to current resident. In his younger years, Jonathan had been a man of precision, discipline, and uncommon skill. A military veteran turned audio engineer, he had built a reputation for restoring hearing to those who had lost it in war. But reputation was a flimsy companion. Didn't sleep beside you when your wife died from cancer in the middle of a bitter January, or when your only son stopped calling after one too many unresolved arguments. So he had stopped listening. Literally, figuratively, entirely. Now his days were filled with silence, cultivated, preferred, defended. The old repair shop attached to his house had once been a sanctuary, humming with soldering irons, transistor radios, and unfiltered purpose. Now it was a museum of dust. Shelves sagged under the weight of unused oscilloscopes. Wire spools rusted slowly in their holders. A cracked magnifying lens hung crookedly over his old workbench. Nothing had been plugged in for years. That morning, like every other, he sat by the back window with his coffee cooling in his hands. The sunlight angled through yellowed curtains and traced the outline of dust motes hanging in the still air. He was thinking about nothing and everything, as men often do when they are old and mostly alone, when he heard the faintest scrape of gravel on the driveway. He ignored it at first. Jehovah's Witnesses, probably, maybe kids with church pamphlets. But then came the sound again, lighter this time, deliberate. Someone was approaching. Jonathan stood slowly, his knees grumbling beneath him, and moved toward the front door. Through the window pane, he saw a child standing on the stoop. She was small, maybe 6, maybe 7, dark skin, scabbed knees, and shoes too large for her feet. Her hair was gathered into thick puffs on either side of her head, each held by mismatched barrettes. A plastic grocery bag hung from her wrist. Her eyes, impossibly large and unblinking, met his through the glass. He opened the door, but only just, enough for his voice to carry out and hers not to carry in. Yes? She looked down into her bag and pulled out a piece of paper, folded 3 times. Then, with both hands, she held it up to him, saying nothing. He didn't move. She waited. Jonathan sighed and opened the screen door. The paper was crumpled but legible. Written in large, uneven letters, clearly by a child, were the words, "My grandma can't hear me. Please fix this." Below the note, held gently in the girl's other hand, was a cracked and scuffed hearing aid. He looked at the device, then at her, then back again. "I don't do that anymore," he said. His voice was hoarse, from disuse as much as age. She didn't answer, just stood there, motionless, as if waiting would change his mind. Something about her stubbornness, no, her stillness, unsettled him. He saw no fear in her eyes, no pleading either. Just the kind of calm you don't expect from a child, the kind that comes from living too long around silence. He reached for the hearing aid without saying another word and took the paper with him. The girl didn't follow. She simply gave a small nod and walked back down the steps, disappearing down the overgrown sidewalk. He closed the door behind him and stood for a long time in the entryway, the paper and the device heavy in his hands. He turned the aid over slowly, inspecting the damage. Cracks along the shell. Moisture corrosion on the battery contacts. The receiver tubing was brittle and yellowing. It had seen better days. So had he. That evening, Jonathan sat at his old workbench for the first time in over a decade. He brushed aside the dust, blew gently on the surface, and opened the drawer where his tools once lived. To his surprise, most of them were still where he had left them. The soldering iron worked. The magnifying lens, though cracked, still enlarged what needed enlarging. He clipped a light to the edge of the bench and flicked it on. Pale yellow spilled over the worn surface. He placed the hearing aid on a microfiber cloth and began disassembly. As he worked, memory flooded him with images he hadn't invited. The face of a young soldier, hearing his fiancée's voice again after 3 years. The tears of a mother whose baby cooed for her, finally audible. The night he first held his own son, whispering promises into a newborn ear. His wife's voice, low, smoky, humming the jazz standards she loved to play on their old record player. He blinked hard and bent over the tiny screws. By midnight, he had separated the components and determined that the inner circuits were intact. What the device needed was structural stabilization, new wiring, and a cleaned microphone port. Doable, but barely. It was an outdated model. Parts would be difficult to come by. The next morning, he waited, though he didn't tell himself that's what he was doing. He sat near the window again, coffee growing cold in his hand, eyes occasionally darting toward the sidewalk. At exactly 9:07, he heard it. The same light steps, the same scrape of small shoes on gravel. She appeared again on the porch. This time she brought a peanut butter sandwich in a paper napkin. She handed it to him without a word, then sat on the stoop with her back to the door. "Name?" he asked. "Maya," she said over her shoulder. He grunted and went back inside. But each day that week she came again. Always with something in her hands, a granola bar, a drawing, a small plastic figurine, always with quiet eyes and soft steps. On the 4th day, she said, "Do you fix broken people too?" He didn't answer. Not because he didn't hear her, but because for the first time in years, he didn't know how. That night, he opened the back closet and found the old binder of schematics from his military work. Spiral-bound, dusty, untouched. Inside were drawings of prototype hearing devices that used vibrational feedback instead of traditional audio relays. Technology too expensive, too experimental, too ahead of its time back then. He had abandoned the project after a budget cut and a moral disagreement with his employer. Now he thumbed through the yellowing pages like a man flipping through a forgotten scripture. He thought of the girl's eyes, of the paper with its crooked letters, of the brittle silence he'd let wrap around his life like a cocoon. Maybe it wasn't too late to break it open. Maybe he could fix something. Someone that still mattered. Outside, cicadas sang in the branches, their hums thick in the air. Jonathan Bale sat alone in his workshop, but for the first time in years, the silence no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like the moment before music begins. Jonathan's hands moved with mechanical steadiness, yet something inside him trembled. Every time he lifted the cracked hearing aid to the light, every time he adjusted his magnifier to study the delicate circuitry, he found himself seeing less of the device and more of the girl who had brought it to him. Maya. The name echoed silently in his mind now. Short, direct, too big for her small body, like her quiet resolve. He couldn't decide if it was her gaze or the way she waited, not with impatience but with quiet certainty, that had pulled him back into the world he'd walked away from. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day that followed for nearly 2 weeks. Always with something in her hands. A sandwich, a packet of stickers, a pebble she claimed looked like a heart. Each item was an offering, wordless and sincere. She never asked if the hearing aid was fixed. She never nagged, pleaded, or begged. She just came, sat on the porch with her knees pulled to her chest, and waited for as long as she could before walking home. Jonathan, at first, said nothing. He wasn't used to company, especially not company that brought such silence with it. But over time he began to talk. A little here, a little there, a grunt that became a sentence that became a question. He learned that Maya's grandmother was named Grace, that Grace used to teach music at the neighborhood community center, and that after her stroke 2 years ago, she'd gone completely deaf. Maya said the hearing aid had been a gift from someone at their church, but it had never worked well. Jonathan asked where Maya's parents were. She didn't answer. One afternoon, while Maya sat sketching on the porch steps, Jonathan emerged from the workshop holding a thin black wire between his fingers. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. "I can't fix it." She looked up. "Not this one," he added, holding the battered hearing aid aloft. "Too old, too damaged, but I can make something better." Maya tilted her head, squinting. "Not just fix," he clarified, "build, from scratch." "Better than before?" "If it works." She smiled, that quiet kind that turned the corners of her mouth upward just enough to show the truth underneath. That night, Jonathan reopened a part of his past he had buried under years of grief and silence. From an old metal cabinet beneath the workbench, he pulled out binders, schematics, scraps of designs he had drawn by hand. Back then, he had been working on a vibrational audio feedback system, something that could help those with profound hearing loss perceive sound through touch. It was considered radical at the time, and the funding had dried up when the company realized the potential profits didn't outweigh the research costs. He had fought to keep it alive, and when he lost, something in him cracked too. But now, that same technology might give Grace not just hearing, but presence, connection, life. If it worked. He spent days dismantling unused devices, harvesting the salvageable parts. He ordered rare components online and waited anxiously for deliveries. He tested and failed and tested again. At one point, he burned out a capacitor and scorched his fingers. The pain made him laugh, a deep, guttural sound that startled him more than the injury. He hadn't laughed in years. Each day, Maya came. She told him about school, about how she helped Grace get dressed in the mornings and cooked oatmeal for dinner when they didn't have much else. She mentioned once, in passing, that the power in their apartment had been off for 2 days, but she said it like it was just weather, a fact, not a complaint. Jonathan began to keep a second chair in the workshop. She never asked for it, but when she arrived and saw it waiting, she sat. She never touched his tools, but she watched with curiosity and silent awe. One day, he let her hold a soldering tool, cold and unplugged, and she beamed like it was made of gold. The new device took shape slowly. It wasn't sleek or stylish, but it was durable, precise, and tailored for Grace's specific range of post-stroke nerve sensitivity. Jonathan tested it against recordings, voice samples, music. He even whispered into it himself, hearing his voice amplified and distorted through his own prototype. For a moment, it made his throat tighten. He imagined Grace hearing Maya's voice again. He imagined that mattering more than anything else. When he was finally ready, he asked Maya to bring her grandmother over. The request surprised her, but she nodded solemnly and promised to return the next day. They arrived just after noon. Grace moved slowly, using a cane and Maya's small shoulder for balance. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a faded maroon sweater despite the heat. Her eyes were clear but cautious. She didn't speak, only watched Jonathan with quiet reservation. He gestured for them to enter, and they followed him into the workshop. He explained, as simply and visually as he could, what he had built. Maya interpreted in gestures, broken and improvised, but enough to get the point across. Grace nodded, then sat down. Jonathan lifted the headband-like receiver and gently adjusted it around her ears and temples. It wasn't quite a hearing aid. It didn't amplify sound through air, but rather converted vibrations into skin-level resonance. It was like listening through the bones, not the ears. He looked at Maya, gave her a small nod. Maya stepped forward and said, softly but clearly, "Grandma?" There was a pause. Then Grace blinked. Her breath hitched. Maya repeated louder, "Can you hear me?" Jonathan watched as Grace raised a trembling hand to her cheek. She didn't answer with words. Instead, her eyes flooded with tears. She reached for Maya and pulled her close. Maya sobbed into her chest. The moment cracked something open inside Jonathan's ribs, an old, forgotten chamber, and for the first time in years, he let the emotion move freely through him. They sat together in the small workshop, just the three of them, surrounded by tools, wires, and the scent of solder. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows over the floor. Inside, a kind of warmth spread, not just in the room, but in the space between them. That evening, Grace invited him to dinner. Their apartment was modest and dim, with flickering bulbs and water-stained walls. But it smelled of thyme and lentils, and the table was covered with mismatched dishes. Grace signed her thanks. Maya translated. Jonathan, awkward at first, eventually smiled, then chuckled, then joined in a lopsided conversation conducted half in words and half in hands. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he had sat at a table with others, since someone had asked him a question, since he'd felt full in a way that had nothing to do with food. After dinner, Maya brought out a sketch pad and showed him a drawing she had made. It was of a woman with long hair sitting at a piano, surrounded by music notes. Above the drawing, she had written, "Grandma used to make music. Now she can hear it again." Jonathan didn't know what to say. He simply nodded and held the drawing like it was made of glass. Later, when he returned home, he set the sketch next to the photograph of his wife that still sat on the mantel. He didn't light a candle or say a prayer. He just stood there, staring, as something small and unfamiliar stirred inside him. The next morning, he awoke earlier than usual. The workshop was already calling, not for a deadline or a paycheck, but for something deeper, something more fragile and rare. Purpose. And in that realization, he knew the hearing aid had never been the only broken thing in the room, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to stay that way. Jonathan didn't sleep that night, though he lay in bed with his eyes closed for hours. His thoughts looped in quiet, endless circuits. Grace's trembling hands, Maya's small voice, the way their arms wrapped around each other and the moment sound returned. The memory repeated itself again and again, not like a wound this time, but like the gentle echo of something newly born. There had been many years when Jonathan feared nothing in his life could ever be different again. That some invisible door had shut behind him and he was doomed to live out his days in the dark, among dust and old machines. But something had cracked open, and through that crack, light had poured in. When morning came, he rose early and put on a clean flannel shirt. It still smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. He made fresh coffee and poured 2 mugs, then hesitated, realizing there was no one to drink the second. He left it on the counter anyway. The sun had barely lifted above the tree line when he opened the door to his workshop. The light streamed across the floor, catching on the polished edge of his soldering station. The place no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like something halfway between a chapel and a playground. He didn't need to work on the hearing device anymore. Grace could hear again, at least in the way that mattered. But that wasn't the point. The work wasn't about fixing now. It was about building. Building something that could last, something that could serve more than one person, something that could say, "We are here, we exist, we matter." So he worked. He drew up blueprints for a simplified version of the model Grace, a hearing device that used similar vibrational resonance, but could be constructed using more affordable parts. He spent hours calibrating the output levels, experimenting with how the skin behind the ear and along the neck responded to different frequencies. He layered copper filament inside flexible housing to allow the user to move freely without disconnection. He wanted the device to feel like nothing, like part of the person. In the evenings, Maya came by after school. Sometimes she brought her homework, sometimes only stories. She talked about the girl in her class who wore lip gloss when no one was looking, about how the lunch lady always gave her an extra milk if she smiled. Grace sometimes joined her, sitting on the edge of the workbench, her hands busy folding napkins or mending a torn sleeve. She seemed stronger now, more alert. The lines in her face hadn't faded, but they no longer sagged with weight. They carried meaning instead. Jonathan started cooking dinner for them once or twice a week. He wasn't much of a chef, but Grace taught him how to make red beans and rice with enough spice to make the eyes water. Maya insisted on making cornbread, which Jonathan accidentally burned the first 3 times. The 4th time, she made him sit and just watch. She worked in silence, hands sure and practiced. He hadn't known a child could move like that with so much confidence and care. She had learned it, no doubt, out of necessity. One evening, while they sat at the table eating stew, Grace pulled out a dusty black binder from her bag. She opened it and showed Jonathan page after page of sheet music, some printed, some handwritten. He realized these were her own arrangements, songs she had composed before her stroke. He turned each page gently, reverently. She reached for her phone and typed something slowly, then showed him the screen. "I want to hear them again." Jonathan's throat tightened. He thought of the small electronic keyboard gathering dust in the back of his workshop. He had used it to test frequencies years ago, and forgotten all about it. The next day, he dug it out and cleaned it. The keys were stiff, some unresponsive. He took it apart, cleaned the contacts, soldered new wiring, and painted over the yellowed plastic with a fresh coat of white enamel. When he brought it to their apartment the following week, Grace's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't hear the music as she once had, but she could feel it now. The keyboard was rigged with the same vibrational interface as her hearing device. When she pressed the keys, light pulses along her arm told her what she was playing. She spent hours that night running her fingers along the keys, rediscovering songs from memory. Jonathan and Maya sat nearby, just watching, not speaking. The following week, Maya came home with a flyer. Family Showcase Day at school. Every student was allowed to bring one family member to show off a talent or share something meaningful. She handed Jonathan the flyer without a word. He read it once and set it down. "You should bring your grandmother," he said. Maya looked at him. "She's your family." Maya's lips pressed together. Then she picked up the flyer and pointed at the line that said family member, parent, guardian, or special adult. "I want you to come." Jonathan's first instinct was to say no. The very idea of standing in front of a room full of parents and teachers and children made his stomach knot. He hadn't set foot in a school since his son was in middle grade. That was a lifetime ago. But he saw the way Maya looked at him. Not with pressure, but with hope. And the words stuck in his throat. He only nodded. The day of the event, he stood outside the school gates for nearly 10 minutes before walking in. He wore his best jeans and a clean shirt. Maya ran up to him, her eyes wide, and grabbed his hand without asking. She led him through the hallways like he was someone important. The classroom was packed with kids and families. Some played instruments, some danced. Some read poems from brightly colored notebooks. When it was Maya's turn, she stood in front of the room, holding a drawing in one hand and Jonathan's wrist in the other. "This is Mr. Jonathan," she said. "He makes machines that help people hear. He made one for my grandma. Now she can hear me again. That's better than magic." The teacher smiled. Jonathan felt heat rise to his face. He didn't know where to look, but the room clapped politely. No one laughed or dismissed her words. For a moment, he was not an old man with scars and silence. He was something else, something useful, something whole. After the event, they walked home together, Maya swinging his hand lightly like she used to do with Grace. At their apartment, Grace met them on the porch. She signed something and Maya translated. "She said you looked very brave." Jonathan laughed, a real laugh, the kind that curled up from deep in the chest. Then he sat down next to Grace and looked at the night sky. The stars were faint, but present. "I lost a family once," he said quietly. "A wife, a son I haven't spoken to in years." Grace touched his hand gently. No words, no gestures, just a hand. Maya sat at their feet, resting her head against his knee. They stayed like that for a long time. Back in his house that night, Jonathan found himself staring at the soldering station. He no longer saw it as a place of retreat. It was a place of return, a place of becoming. He had come to believe that silence was safer, that no noise meant no risk. But now he understood something deeper. There are some kinds of silence that can heal, but there are others that only grow darker the longer they're kept. He would not return to the dark, not now, not with them. The days that followed the family showcase passed in a golden haze. Something in the air felt different, not just warmer, but lighter. Jonathan moved with a rhythm he had long forgotten, not fast, but purposeful. The mornings began with coffee brewed in 2 cups instead of 1, even if the second would remain untouched until a visitor arrived. Evenings were filled with the soft hum of conversation, of gestures between Grace and Maya, of the quiet clink of dishes, and sometimes even laughter. In between, he worked on refining the prototype, on expanding it, on dreaming about a line of devices that could be affordable, durable, human. He had started sketching again, filling notepads with diagrams and annotations, even reaching out to old contacts, carefully, cautiously. He wasn't sure what he hoped to build yet, but for the first time in years he wanted to create something not because it would sell, but because it could matter. He began clearing out the back room of the repair shop, dusting off old shelves, reorganizing his tools, and mounting a corkboard to pin up his schematics. Maya called it his lab. Grace offered to sew a curtain for the doorway, said it would make it feel more official. He didn't argue. He liked the idea of them claiming pieces of his world for their own. But peace, Jonathan had learned, was a fragile thing, and it rarely came without interruption. It started with a knock on the door. It was a weekday morning, and Maya had just gone to school. Grace was in the kitchen folding laundry, and Jonathan was adjusting a calibration device in the workshop when the sound came. He didn't recognize the rhythm of the knock, not Maya's impatient tap or the mail carrier's too polite raps. This one was firm, heavy, authoritative. He opened the door to find a tall man in a suit standing on the porch. Gray hair swept back with too much gel, gold cufflinks gleaming under the cuff of a tailored jacket. His skin was pale, and his expression was colder than the December wind that crept in behind him. "Mr. Bale?" the man asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Jonathan nodded slowly. "I'm Arthur Langston, Maya's grandfather, Grace's former son-in-law." Jonathan blinked, not out of confusion, but out of the sudden drop he felt in his stomach. Langston. The name had come up once, long ago, in one of Maya's offhand remarks. Something about her mother's family not visiting anymore. She'd said it without emotion, as if she knew better than to expect kindness from old bloodlines. Arthur stepped forward without waiting for permission, casting a disapproving glance over the porch, the chipped wood, the cluttered table against the railing. "I understand you've been playing house with my granddaughter and her invalid caretaker." Jonathan bristled. "I've come to let you know I'm filing for custody." The words hung in the air like smoke. Arthur continued, his tone clipped. "My son, Maya's father, is in no condition to care for her, but I have resources, stability, legal standing. That child deserves a real home, not this setup." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Grace is her home. Maya's not going anywhere." "We'll let the courts decide," Arthur replied, already stepping back toward his black sedan parked along the curb. The next week was a blur of paperwork, appointments, and silent tension. A woman from Child Protective Services visited their home. She asked questions, took notes, walked through every room with a practiced gaze, noting the old carpet, the dated appliances, the hearing devices on Grace's bedside table. She asked Maya about her bedtime, her meals, her feelings of safety. Maya answered politely, but with guarded eyes. She had learned, somehow, how to read the room and protect what she loved. Jonathan called a lawyer, one who worked with families in low-income neighborhoods. He was young but earnest, and he listened carefully as Jonathan explained their situation. Grace sat beside him, signing slowly, while Maya translated with small hands and sharp glances. Arthur filed the custody petition a day later. The hearing was scheduled for the following month, but the stress arrived instantly. Grace stopped playing the keyboard in the evenings. Maya grew quieter, her drawings more hurried and less colorful. Jonathan started having trouble sleeping again. Old thoughts crept in, memories of failure, of absence, of watching the people he loved suffer because he hadn't been enough. He tried not to let it show, but Maya saw. One night, after dinner, she came to him with a question written in a spiral notebook. "Are you going to leave us?" Jonathan stared at the page for a long time. Then he took her pencil and wrote underneath it, "Never." She didn't ask again. The day of the hearing came too fast. Grace wore her best dress, the one with the embroidered cuffs she used to wear to teach music. Jonathan wore his old navy blazer, its fabric worn thin at the elbows. Maya wore a white blouse and a black skirt, her curls pulled back with a ribbon Grace had sewn for her. The courtroom was too big, too clean, too cold. Arthur sat at the opposite table with two attorneys in sharp suits. He barely looked at Maya. When he did, it was with the same disapproving tilt of his chin that Jonathan had seen on their first meeting. The judge was a woman in her 50s, with silver streaks in her bun and a tired kindness in her eyes. She listened patiently as both sides presented their arguments. Arthur's lawyer spoke first. He painted a picture of neglect, not of abuse, but of incapacity. He described Grace as infirm, dependent, unable to manage the needs of a growing child. He called Jonathan a well-meaning stranger with no legal claim and a questionable past. He referenced Jonathan's honorable discharge from the military, his history of isolation, even his mental health. He spoke of Maya's hearing issues and suggested that her environment was ill-equipped to support her needs. When it was their turn, Grace typed her testimony and Maya read it aloud. "I may not hear with my ears, but I hear with my hands, with my eyes, with my love. I raised Maya since she was a baby. I was there when she took her first steps, when she said her first words. I lost my hearing, not my heart." Jonathan stood next. His voice was steady, if rough. "I've spent most of my life fixing things, machines, radios, implants, but nothing I've ever built mattered until I met Maya and Grace. I didn't give them a home. They gave one to me." He handed the judge a folder of documents, designs, blueprints, testimonies from two local doctors who had evaluated Grace's condition, and signed letters from Maya's teacher and school counselor praising her behavior, intelligence, and emotional health. Then the judge asked to hear from Maya. She stepped up slowly, standing on a small platform so she could be seen clearly. "My grandma can't hear me the way other people do," she said, her voice small but unwavering. "But she listens. She always listens. And Mr. Jonathan, he's the one who made her hear me again. He made something with his hands that helped us find each other again." She took a breath. "My grandpa doesn't like deaf people. He never visited us. He only came when he wanted to take me away. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know how we live. But Mr. Jonathan does, and my grandma does, and I want to stay with them." The courtroom was quiet. The judge leaned forward, her voice soft. "This court finds no reason to remove Maya from her current guardianship. The evidence shows that she is loved, supported, and thriving. Custody remains with Miss Grace Brooks. Mr. Bale's involvement is formally recognized as a part of her care structure." Arthur didn't argue. He stood, stiff and silent, and walked out. Grace sat down with a visible shudder. Maya wrapped her arms around her waist, and Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Outside, the air felt warmer. The clouds had parted. The sun shone faintly through, casting their shadows on the courthouse steps as they descended, together. That night, back in the apartment, Maya pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket. It was another drawing. 3 figures stood hand in hand. One had glasses and a beard. Another wore a long dress with music notes floating around her. The third was small, bright, with a purple hearing aid proudly colored in crayon. She handed it to Jonathan without a word. And in that moment, he knew. The battle was over. But their story had just begun. The days after the courtroom victory passed in a daze of cautious relief. The threat that had loomed so large, Arthur Langston's cold stare, his suits, his lawyers, his sense of entitlement, had finally faded behind them. The legal papers were signed. Maya would stay where she belonged. Grace and Jonathan could breathe again, even if the fear hadn't entirely left their bones. But something else lingered, not dread, not quite, more like a heaviness that no one wanted to name, the kind that comes after battle, after survival, when the body still waits for the next strike even though the field has cleared. Grace moved a little slower those days, though she smiled more. Jonathan spent hours in his workshop tweaking his prototypes and sketching new ideas, yet found his thoughts drifting more than he liked. And Maya had grown quieter. It wasn't the silence of sadness. It was the silence of knowing too much, too soon. She still colored, still drew stories in her notebook, but the pictures had changed. There were fewer suns, fewer birds, more buildings, more wires, more people with one ear colored purple. Jonathan didn't ask. He just pinned each new drawing to the corkboard in his lab, in the space he had started calling the gallery. One rainy afternoon, Maya returned from school looking pale. Her hair was damp, her shoes soaked. Grace met her at the door, touched her forehead, then looked to Jonathan with concern. They dried her off and made tea with too much honey. Maya insisted she was fine, but a few hours later she curled up on the couch and fell asleep without dinner. Grace covered her with a blanket, sat beside her, and placed a hand lightly on her back. It was a mother's gesture, not in name, but in everything that mattered. The next morning, Maya woke with a headache and a slight fever. They kept her home from school. She slept most of the day. Jonathan worked quietly in the next room, listening for any sound. When she woke, her voice was hoarse, her balance off. Grace signed something, but Maya only frowned. Then she shook her head. "I can't hear you," she whispered. At first, Jonathan thought she meant she was groggy, but Grace looked up sharply. She tried again, slow, deliberate signs. Maya blinked, confused. She raised her hand to her ear, tapped it gently, then again, harder. "I can't hear." They rushed her to the clinic. A short wait turned into a long one. The nurse led them to a private room. Tests followed, whispered conversations between doctors. A pediatric neurologist was brought in. MRI scans were scheduled. Hours passed like years. When the doctor returned, his face was composed, practiced. "There's been some swelling in the temporal lobe," he said gently. "Likely viral, possibly connected to a dormant condition triggered by recent stress or trauma." Jonathan sat perfectly still. Her hearing may not return fully, perhaps not at all. Grace reached for Maya's hand. Maya didn't react. "She's reading lips now," the doctor continued. "We recommend speech therapy, support services, but I suggest beginning ASL instruction immediately. It will help her adjust emotionally and socially." Grace nodded once. Jonathan said nothing. The doctor's tone softened further. "She's going to need consistency. Familiar faces, stable caregivers." Grace placed a hand on Maya's back. Jonathan looked at the child who had brought sound back into their lives and now faced losing it herself. On the way home, no one spoke. Maya leaned against Grace in the back seat, staring out the window at the falling rain. Jonathan drove slowly, both hands gripping the wheel, knuckles white. He hated the feeling building in his chest, powerlessness. He had always known how to fix things, machines, circuits, wires, but this was a betrayal of the very gift they'd thought they had reclaimed. That night, he sat in the workshop long after everyone else had gone to bed. The rain drummed against the roof. The soldering iron lay cold. He stared at the corkboard now covered in Maya's drawings and tried to breathe. He remembered something she had said once, before any of this began. "Do you fix broken people too?" He hadn't answered then. Now he understood why. People didn't get fixed. Not like devices. They healed, maybe, or they didn't, but healing wasn't mechanical. It was messier, slower. It required something he hadn't practiced in years: patience, presence, love. The next morning, he brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table waiting. When Grace joined him, her face lined with worry, he didn't speak. He just slid a notepad across the table with a single sentence written in block letters. "Teach me to sign." Grace looked up, eyes wide. "I want to speak her language now," he added beneath it, "the one that doesn't need sound." And so they began. Every day, between lunch and dinner, Grace and Jonathan sat together with handbooks, video tutorials, and Maya herself as their most patient teacher. At first, Jonathan's hands fumbled. His fingers were stiff, movements awkward. But Maya never mocked. She corrected him with a smile. Grace showed him shortcuts, tips, the fluid grace of someone who had long since made a new home in silence. Jonathan realized quickly that learning to sign was more than memorizing gestures. It was about rhythm, expression, eye contact. It was about slowing down, listening with your whole body. He began to understand what Grace had always known. Communication was a dance, not a transaction. Maya's adjustment was not without pain. There were days she sat with her arms folded, eyes cast down, refusing to look at anyone. Days when she tried to speak and couldn't understand her own voice. Nights when she cried in her sleep, waking in a panic, clutching at her ears as if she might tear the silence out of them. Jonathan never left her alone during those nights. He sat by her bed, not speaking, not touching, just being there. A presence, a signal, a quiet yes to whatever she needed. Slowly, things changed. Maya began using her hands more fluidly, not just with Grace, but with Jonathan too. She taught him her own made-up signs, little gestures for silly, hungry, bad hair day. She wrote less and signed more. Her eyes lit up again when she made him laugh. She started drawing again. Brighter pictures now. One showed 3 figures inside a heart, each of them holding a hand sign for family. Jonathan hung it above the kitchen table. One evening, while they cleaned up after dinner, Maya tapped his arm and signed a sentence slowly. "Now I'm like you and Grandma." Jonathan paused. He signed back, his fingers careful. "What do you mean?" "I use my hands. I listen with my heart." He felt his chest tighten. He looked at Grace, who was already watching, tears gathering in her eyes. Jonathan knelt down beside Maya and took her small hands in his. He didn't speak. He didn't sign. He just looked at her, fully, clearly, as if seeing her for the very first time, even though she had always been there. Later that night, as the house fell quiet and the streetlights flickered outside, Jonathan stood alone in the workshop. The prototype for the model Grace sat gleaming on the bench, surrounded by spare parts and open journals. He touched it gently, then began working again, not because it was broken, but because he wanted to make something new. Something not to restore what had been lost, but to embrace what had become. The future was uncertain. Maya's hearing might never return, but she had gained something else. And so had they. They had found a language no one could take away, a voice without sound, and in that, a truth deeper than anything Jonathan had ever engineered. The summer that followed was not marked by sweeping change or dramatic events. There were no more courtrooms, No more knocks on the door that brought unwelcome ghosts. Instead, the change came quietly, gradually, like the way morning light creeps across the kitchen floor before anyone is awake. It was in the way Jonathan moved through the house now, no longer like a visitor or an intruder, but like someone home. It was in the ease of Grace's smile, the soft lines around her eyes relaxing as if time itself had decided to be kinder. It was in Maya's laugh, returned at last, not loud, but bright, a laugh that lived in her shoulders, her hands, her whole body. The work in the shop had changed too. Jonathan no longer thought of it as repair. It had become creation, transformation. He converted the dusty back room of the record shop into a space filled with light, color, and motion. Shelves, once weighed down with corroded circuit boards, now held clear bins labeled with careful handwriting, resistors, magnets, flexible speakers, conductive film. Grace sewed curtains with vibrant patterns that danced in the breeze, and Maya made paper signs for each corner. Feel it here. Light speaks too. Touch this sound. They named it Echo and Light. At first, it was just the three of them. Jonathan experimenting, Maya helping him test textures and response vibrations, Grace tuning color pulses to match musical scales. But news traveled fast in the community, faster than Jonathan expected. A teacher from Maya's school stopped by one Saturday morning with her teenage nephew who had partial hearing loss. Then, a speech therapist brought in two children who had outgrown their bulky devices and were too embarrassed to wear them anymore. By the end of July, Jonathan had installed a doorbell with a strobe light, ordered 5 extra chairs, and started keeping a sign-in sheet. He never called it a business. It wasn't. He refused to take money from families. Donations arrived anyway. Tools, materials, a thermos of soup from someone's grandmother. One parent left a thank you note taped to the door with 2 $20 bills inside. Jonathan gave the money to Grace and told her to buy more batteries. Grace used it to buy watercolor paints for Maya. The kids who came to Echo and Light were different from one another. Some were profoundly deaf, some wore implants, some used speech, some did not. But in the space they built, none of that mattered. They played sound games, tracing vibrations through their palms. They painted to music, even if they couldn't hear the notes. They sat on the floor and signed stories and shared silence that didn't feel empty, but full. Grace began teaching formal ASL classes 3 evenings a week. She adapted her old music curriculum into something new. Sound as movement, as light, as rhythm. Maya helped her with the visuals, sketching out song maps that tracked tempo and tone with color and shape. Jonathan sat at the back during every lesson, scribbling notes not only on technology, but on humanity. One rainy Sunday in August, Jonathan returned from the hardware store to find the apartment warm, with smells of cinnamon and nutmeg. Maya had baked something, sort of. The muffins were lopsided and sticky, but when he took a bite, he told her they were perfect. She signed back with a grin. "You're a terrible liar." He replied, "Only when it matters." That night, as thunder rolled gently across the sky, the three of them sat by the window with mugs of warm milk. Grace rested her head on Jonathan's shoulder, Maya curled against his side. No one spoke. No one needed to. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, the silence was rich and whole. Later, as Jonathan walked through the record shop turning off lights, something caught his eye near the fridge. A piece of paper, slightly crooked, was taped up with a strip of purple washi tape. It was a crayon drawing. Maya's hand, no doubt. 3 stick figures stood under a bright yellow sun. One was tall and had a beard. One wore a skirt and had music notes floating around her head. The smallest one had a hearing aid drawn in bright purple on one ear. Above the picture were block letters that read, "We talk with our hands. We listen with our hearts. That makes us a real family." Jonathan stood there for a long time, not moving. His throat tightened, not with sadness, but with something deeper, recognition. It wasn't a feeling he had known how to name before, not even when he'd held his newborn son years ago, not when he'd stood beside his wife's hospital bed for the last time. This was quieter, heavier, but full of light. He reached out, touched the drawing gently with 2 fingers, and traced the crayon lines like they were sacred. Behind him, soft footsteps padded across the tile. He turned and saw Maya standing there in her socks, hair messy from sleep, rubbing her eyes. He crouched down slowly, opened his arms, and she walked into them without a word. He held her close, steady and quiet. "You fix me first, kid," he whispered into her hair. His voice caught, broke slightly. She didn't respond, but her arms tightened around his neck. Grace watched from the hallway. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply looked, and in her eyes was a peace so deep that Jonathan felt it before he saw it. They never spoke the word family again. They didn't need to. It had taken root in every corner of their lives, in the meals they cooked together, in the signs they learned, in the way they watched out for each other when one grew quiet or tired or sad. It lived in the laughter that sometimes rose between them at dinner, in the drawings taped to walls and shelves, in the humming of the old record player that Jonathan had restored and left on the lowest shelf so Grace could feel it through the floor. One afternoon in September, a reporter from a local community newsletter stopped by. She had heard about the workshop from a parent whose son had created his own vibration-sensitive drum set. She asked if she could interview them, maybe take a few photos. Jonathan was reluctant at first, but Grace nodded and Maya signed, "Tell our story. Someone else might need it." So they did. The article ran under the title, "A House Where Silence Sings." They received 23 letters over the following month. A man from Kentucky asking for plans to build his own vibration reader. A teacher from Nevada hoping to start a classroom project using touch-based music. A mother from Chicago who had never met another family raising a deaf child and wanted to say thank you. Jonathan kept the letters in a box under his bed. He didn't open them often. Just knowing they were there was enough. He no longer needed to prove his work mattered. He no longer needed the noise of the world to tell him he was worth something. In the stillness of each day, over morning coffee, over the small repairs, over the quiet moments where Maya leaned her head on his arm, or Grace passed him a joke scribbled on a notepad, he found the only kind of validation that had ever truly mattered. They had not erased the past. They had not replaced what had been lost, but they had chosen to become something new, something stronger. And in that, he understood something he hadn't when all this began. Sometimes life doesn't give you a second chance at what you lost. It gives you a first chance at what you were meant to find. He stepped out onto the porch that evening as the sun began to set. The sky was streaked with amber and rose. He looked back through the open door at Grace humming a tune through her fingertips and Maya drawing a new poster for the Echo and Light window. He smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because finally it was enough. If this story meant something to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Watch our next videos to discover more, and if you know someone who should hear this, share it with them.